First, I'd invite Susan McKinney for our welcome. Susan?
I want to give one of these to Brian.
Okay. First, if you are not the speaker, if you would mute your Zoom so we don't have a lot of feedback in here. Thanks so much. Welcome to the third in a series of peer-to-peer webinars for RC&D Council. Today's topic is wetlands and wildlife. I'm Susan McKinney. I'm the Executive Director for Appalachian RC&D Council located in Upper Northeast Tennessee, and we're representing the National Association of RC&D Councils for this webinar series. Let me advance my slide here. The National Association of RC&D Councils has embraced a new model of engaging and supporting local councils. This new approach utilizes subawards that provide funds, leverage local investment, and build capacity across the landscape. This approach was launched in earnest in June 2019, and in the past 14 months, more than 35 subawards have obligated $389,000 for projects across the country. The funds come from the USDA NRCS, and they facilitate outreach and training on Farm Bill programs. Farm Bill programs support youth interns, career development, and build partnerships with local and national conservation organizations. This is the third of 8 webinars that are being held with the support of NRCS, with the goal of expanding these activities by highlighting success stories and creating connections. We have this quick survey. It's only 3 questions. If you would complete this while I do a brief introduction of today's presenters. Joining me today is Dana York. She just spoke to you a moment ago. She's the retired Associate Chief for NRCS. She's a farm owner, a small business owner, and an all-around cool cat, and facilitator for this webinar series. Dave Wilson is with Delmarva RC&D Council. Bridget Estelle Costanzo is with Working Lands for Wildlife Coordinator, Eastern U.S., NHQ area-wide planning team, Natural Resources Conservation Services, USDA specialist. That is a mouthful. Okay. And also running our technical aspects of the webinar in the background is Rosie McVeigh. She's our AmeriCorps service member with ARC&D. And I'd like to also thank and recognize any of the board members from National Association of RC&D Councils that are attending today. We appreciate you all being here. Turn it over to you, Dana. You're still muted, Dana.
Thank you. And if you didn't hear me earlier, if you can go down in the chat, which is down at the bottom of the boxes, and press on that. And please give us your name and the name of your RC&D or where you're from, what state you're from, so we can see who is on the call. We're going to go through the 2 presenters first, and starting with Dave, and then we will have a questions and answers to ask both of those. So Rosie, if you can make me so I can share my screen, please.
You should be good.
Okay, just now. All right. So
I'm sorry, Dana. I think we can go ahead and close the poll, Rosie.
All right. So let me get this started. And as we said, our first presenter is Dave Wilson, who is from the Eastern Shore. And I lived there for 17 years before I came back to my farm in Tennessee. So Dave, take it away, and you just let me know when I need to go to the next slide. You may have to unmute yourself. Let's see. Can you see the presenters? Because I can't. Rosie, is Dave?
Let me check.
There again. Am I on now?
You are. Okay.
All right. Well, Dana, when you lived in Centerville on the Eastern Shore, you were 17 miles from my hometown for the last 50 years, Chestertown.
Okay.
And I couldn't see all the names when they first came up, but I'd like to say hello to one of my favorite people on that list was Craig Hartstock from Western Maryland.
Yeah.
So I hope he's there. And you know, the title of today is Wetlands and Wildlife. So I've broken it down into freshwater wetlands, tidal marshes, and wildlife. Okay, next slide. We work with a lot of county governments. This was a 95-acre farm field 2 years ago, and I'm an agricultural guy, so converting 95 acres into a park, you know, we can assist them in many ways. So this 95 acres was turned into 4 wetland sites for a total of about 16 acres, at least 16 acres of wetland that looks just like this. I took this picture yesterday, as a matter of fact, but somewhere in my file, I had another picture of these cattails. And when the cattails are green and alive, this is a beautiful picture. Unfortunately, yesterday, you know, they're dormant and they're dead now. Next slide. That's the first first of the 4 wetlands. This is the second of the 4 wetlands. And believe it or not, when they started filling up with water, it was unbelievable the waterfowl we had in there, from ducks to you name it. I had a list of the different kind of ducks that were used in that area. And you can see that you see a lot of open water, but over time, the grasses will expand. See in the foreground, the grass is coming up through the water. Some plants like deep water, some plants like shallow water. And not only did we do 4 wetlands on this 95-acre property, but we planted the rest of the acres into pollinator habitat. Next slide. Okay, this is a private landowner. What we're finding out is farmers have a lot of wet soil, and it's hard to get on and plant when you should in the spring because it's too wet, and then the plant is not really planted at the opportune time. Same thing in the wintertime. We've had farmers have to wait till the ground is frozen because it's wet. By that time, soybeans, for example, have shattered, whether it's corn or soybeans or whatever, yield is reduced. Okay, next slide. Oh, okay, we missed out on a bunch. I got the wrong slideshow up here somewhere. My IT guy's going, sorry about that. We had some other good slides, but we'll go from there. So we've moved in now to the second of the marsh, the marsh wetlands. 20 years ago, just like for the wetlands, well, let's go back to the wetlands just a second to comment. 20 years ago, we partnered with DNR to do wetlands as part of this compact in the Chesapeake Bay, where all the Bay states that drain into the Chesapeake Bay, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C., they established goals for each other. And those goals included acres of wetland. So 10 years ago, we did about 300 acres on 60 sites. The last 10 years, we've done 500 acres on about 100 sites. And so I don't know how we're doing on the goals, but we seem to be pushing it pretty good, meeting the goals of how many wetlands. I got an application in right now to DNR for 22 more wetland sites, totaling about 110 acres. So there doesn't seem to be any lack of money. And the 3 RC&Ds in Maryland are very fortunate to have the Chesapeake Bay here, because all kinds of money is coming in to keep the Chesapeake Bay cleaner, to make it cleaner than it is, including the Maryland legislature, who puts up big bucks for the wetlands. Now we'll move into the tidal marshes. Again, in 1987, up till 1987, landowners were stabilizing their shoreline with revetments, massive amounts of rock. And when you go back and look at these sites, there's twice as much rock there, and the expense of putting that rock in place, that it should be. So in 1987, this new alternative came about called living shorelines, where you reduce the amount of rock considerably, and you substitute that with marsh grasses to stop erosion on the eroding bank, like you see here in the background was there. The stone here is what we call a stone sill. It's parallel to the shoreline, about 35 feet out. Behind the sill and the eroding bank, we fill with sand, and then we come in and plant it from high tide to mid tide with smooth cordgrass, and then from high tide back to the base of the eroding bank with salt meadow hay. One is Spartina alterniflora, the one closer to the rock, and Spartina patens is the one back by the bank. Okay, Dana, next slide. Now this was a project on down at Smith Island. I don't know if anybody have ever heard of Smith Island cakes, but that's where Smith Island cake comes from. It's a 10-layer cake, which is wonderful. Dana, are you familiar with the Smith Island cake? Okay, they're pretty doggone good, but they're also pretty doggone expensive. This project we did, $2.2 million, was to protect one of the 3 towns on the island. There's Tylerton, there's Jewel, and there's Rhodes Point. Rhodes Point was being protected by a marsh that was only 300 feet wide. But that marsh was eroding 10 to 12 feet a year. So it don't take much math to figure out how long it's going to take for that 300-foot wide marsh to disappear. And there's no doubt about it, Rhodes Point would be gone. It's just gone with a 35-mile fetch out into the bay. You get some mighty big waves and a lot of energy. Behind that rock, this is rock breakwaters out there. They're each about 200 feet long with a gap between them about 200 feet. That breaks up the energy and allows the Spartina alternative floor, in this case that you're looking at, to grow behind it. You kind of look way out into yonder, you'll see some excavators on barges. When we did this $2.2 million project, there was so many pieces of equipment there and barges. It reminded me of what Normandy must have looked like, with all the battleships and U-boats and boats and whoever else was out there. Okay, Dana, next.
Okay.
Now, the thing about living shoreline projects and the grasses that you put in it lends itself great to using volunteers. We've used volunteers from Cub Scouts to Girl Scouts to every school grade, environmental and ecology clubs in the high school, even seniors. I had an 84-year-old lady out there several times participating. So it really lends itself fantastic to that. The dearest moment I had was the Baltimore School of the Deaf came down. And so every time they had a question, they would run up to you and you had to talk to them in sign language, to keep them going straight. So go to the next slide. Now, the plants come in a tray with 72 plants to a tray. If you look up in the upper left-hand corner where that last tray is, you'll see 2 buckets. They're for the volunteers to carry the fertilizer down to where the holes are and the plants are going to go in and dump it in. And over to the right, you'll see a steel kind of an auger, and that's what makes the holes. With an auger like that and a 3-inch bit, you can really make some holes in a quick period of time. Some teachers don't like the sound, the loud sound of the motor, the engine. They don't like the little bit of smell of the exhaust, so they make the kids use dibble bars. And I think that's because that might be the most amount of work they had in the last week or something. But it works out good. You divide the school teams up, or the youth groups up into teams of 3. One makes a hole, one drops an ounce of Osmocote or slow release fertilizer in the hole, and the third person drops the plant in the hole and stomps it shut. It really does work good. You see the orange flag in the middle of the plants there? And if you look behind a little bit, you'll see another orange flag. We always have to put the flags in where the high tide is. And we tell the volunteers, one plant goes to the high tide side, to the right, other plants go to the left, because otherwise they may get them mixed up. Now, the person in the background with the green shirt on, that's our other steel auger. He's going ahead, that right there. Thank you. He's going ahead and she's going ahead, whoever it is, making holes ahead of the fertilizer and ahead of the plants. Okay, Dana. This is an older project, been in 20 years. You've got a very mature marsh behind it. Again, the purpose of the rock is just for 2 years. It takes 2 years for the marsh grass plants to become established. And after that, in some cases, you don't even need the rock anymore because the plants are so effective. The rock is really the first line of defense against waves, both boat and wind generated. But then the plants are the second line of defense, because when a storm comes in like Katrina, the plants lay down and form like a protective blanket, and the waves are crashing down on that blanket and pretty well protects the sand that we brought in to plant it in. Now, if that blanket doesn't work, Then you got the rhizomes and the roots going everywhere. So that between the three, the rock, the blanket when it lays down, and the roots and the rhizomes, these things really work. After Katrina, there was 250 people, mostly agency type people, going all over the state looking for damage. And in our shore erosion projects, they found no damage at all, because it's what we call working with Mother Nature. On a natural resource management area, we had done 14 projects using this kind of a structure right here. And our next project was going to be 1,500 feet long, but we noticed, look, everywhere there's sunlight, there's plants, there's grasses growing. Everywhere there's shade, the grasses aren't growing. So instead of doing a project like this for $150 a foot, we brought a guy in to do some pruning, eliminated the shade, grasses came in just like that. Now we got a solid length of grasses protecting the bank. Okay, Dana. There's another sill to the right, you can see. And in the background, this is an area that youth in the town of Oxford use a lot. When we do these living shorelines, particularly with a homeowner, you always get the question, well, can I leave a little bit of area out for the kids and the grandkids to swim? That's not a problem. And typically we leave out about 50 feet, and that way they can use it for a canoe and kayak launch and swimming or whatever. But you can see we do get a pretty good stand of these marsh grasses in all of these projects. Okay, Dana?
That's the last one.
Well, son of a gun. We'll have to send you my real slideshow one of these days. Well, I'll tell you, when we go back to the agenda, the other two was a wildlife survey. We just come, in fact, I had a picture of it on there. We just completed a $45,000 survey about hunter attitudes. Can you see that hunter attitude survey? Kind of like that?
Yeah.
And, my goodness, I read that thing, 115 pages. It's what our wildlife people and our legislature will look at. How do we need to change the wildlife regulations in the state of Maryland? Because this thing covered things you would not even imagine. It is very, very comprehensive. And it's a good guide to changing some of the regulations possibly. And the last thing I wanted to talk about in my little agenda at the first slide was DNR Wildlife Administration bought a fairly big farm, which used to be owned by the Catholic Church. And their goal for that property is waterfowl. So we just finished designing 3 ponds to bring in the waterfowl. As a matter of fact, we bid them out, and tomorrow we're getting ready to award the bid. RC&D will be inspectors on the site, checking the 3 ponds as they're being built. And so that's my 2 things for the wildlife portion of this talk.
Great.
How much time did I go over, or didn't I?
You're just perfect. We're going to start with Bridget, and then I know when we come back, one of the questions I'm going to ask you, Dave, is talk a little bit about the funding, how you got your funding.
Sure. Okay. All right.
Okay.
I figured that'd be a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm going to share again, and we're going to take this one down, and we will have Bridget. There we go. Well, there we go. Okay. Okay, Bridget.
Okay, I'm Bridget Costanzo. I think as I
Oops,
was
sorry.
introduced earlier, I'm with Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is part of USDA. And I'm going to talk to you today, give you a pretty brief overview of our Working Lands for Wildlife initiative. Next slide. So Working Lands for Wildlife is not a program within the Farm Bill. You won't find it in the Farm Bill as one of the funded programs, but it's more of a partnership it was initiated in 2010 with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service under an MOU that was later renewed in 2016. So it's a partnership, but we do have projects, and the projects that are funded are through various Farm Bill programs, with that funding going to ag producers as financial assistance. And so that would be under our Environmental Quality Incentives Program, our Ag Conservation Easements Program, and the newer Conservation Stewardship Program that pays landowners to do essentially suites of conservation practices that advance stewardship for specific natural resource needs. Next slide. So the concept of working lands for wildlife came about because prior to that, there hadn't been any big national initiatives that weren't as focused on traditional regulatory approaches to recovering species. So back then, and now it continues to sometimes be the case, that regulation is really the only common sense approach to resolving a species population crash. For instance, with alligator, there were overhunting issues, and that was a regulatory fix. And for bald eagle, a few decades back, we had a big DDT problem, and that also was a regulatory fix. So sometimes that is the appropriate tool to use, but in many cases, we can do a lot of conservation and maybe even achieve, often achieve more with voluntary conservation approaches. So this is where Working Lands for Wildlife came in, and how it was conceived by NRCS and our partners at Fish and Wildlife Service, is that we could make some policy changes that would make it easier for landowners to do conservation for species that were at risk of extinction and therefore at risk of some type of added regulation on private lands that would be applied through the Endangered Species Act. And so instead we designed this approach that would be voluntary and would achieve some of the same recovery goals that might have been done under regulation, and sometimes achieve goals that really can't be regulated, or it's not politically possible or desirable to approach it with a regulatory tool. So we're looking at all voluntary conservation through this program. Next slide. So this slide shows some of the species, just to give you some examples of some of the ones that Working Lands for Wildlife has targeted over the years. And those where you see the red cross out is where we got repeated decisions from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that there was no need to list, or in some of these cases, they actually delisted. So took off the Endangered Species Act list, a number of species nationwide. And so where possible, this is part of the goal of the partnership, is to apply conservation in a targeted manner so that over a period of time, we can actually achieve both conservation for the species, but also regulatory relief for ag producers. Next slide. So the way that we achieve this is that there's a programmatic agreement under the Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act between Fish and Wildlife Service and NRCS, and it provides for exemptions for ag producers that participate in Working Lands for Wildlife if they implement their conservation practices in the manner described in the plan that's written for them by NRCS. And as long as they do that, there's no concern for any regulation, even if they were to accidentally kill one of these species that's listed or that's being considered for listing. There's still no violation there. There's no regulatory action. They're protected because they've voluntarily participated in a program that's targeting and achieving recovery. And so they're helping us, and so we're helping them by protecting them from any fear of any kind of regulation. So we're providing that peace of mind to encourage them to participate. Next slide. And so as a result of the work today, just to give you some examples of what this looks like on a big landscape scale, some of the species that we work on for New England cottontail, which occurs in 6 states, we got a decision from Fish and Wildlife Service in 2015 to not list that species. And the regulatory peace of mind that was provided to producers that have this species on their property covered 3.7 million acres. And so similarly, in the lower Mississippi Delta for Louisiana black bear, that protection covers an area of 33.4 million acres. And then out west for sage grouse, where we've had 2 consecutive decisions by Fish and Wildlife Service and to not list that species. That decision impacts 252 million acres of both public and private lands in 11 states. So the regulatory peace of mind that we're providing, it applies to those landowners, but then the listing decisions, when they're favorable, also benefit even other public lands, but definitely other private lands that maybe they didn't even participate in a Farm Bill program. Maybe they're not an ag producer, but because of the conservation that's achieved through Working Lands for Wildlife, that species is not listed, and therefore there's no additional regulation on those properties. Next slide. And we call this our recipe for success, or the Working Lands for Wildlife model, or how we achieve conservation on the ground. And so it starts with trust and credibility. Obviously, USDA and RCS, we already have strong relationships with ag producers and rural communities. So that's the basis of everything we do. And then when we identify an opportunity to establish a new initiative for one of these species or one of these ecosystems, we work with the people in that community and their leaders to develop a shared vision for how we would go about operating in that geography, what conservation practices they're interested in implementing. And then once we've got that shared vision laid out, we develop a strategic approach, which is a geographic targeting for the work. Once it's underway, we also fund a number of projects to measure outcomes from the work. So there's outputs, how many acres of different practices we do, but then there's also outcomes, like did we get a favorable listing decision? Are we seeing stabilization or an increase in a population? So those are the kinds of things that we measure with our outcomes assessment. And we do annual reporting out to the public on our outputs so that people can look on any of our websites and they can see annually what practices we're doing, where we're doing it, how many acres we're doing. It's all partnership work, so there's a lot of leveraging involved. And then we already talked about the regulatory predictability. Next slide. And so this started smallish, but it's grown to 24 initiatives nationwide. Some of those are state managed initiatives and some of them are nationally managed initiatives. We've got a suite of those. 48 states at this point are participating in 9 different landscapes or ecosystems, and 7,400 producers have signed up for one of the Farm Bill programs under a Working Lands for Wildlife contract. So to date, we've got just over 10 million acres enrolled. Next slide. And I know this map is a little bit hard to see, but I'll give you information on how to access our website and whatnot at the end of the talk. This is a map of all of the initiatives in one map for FY21, and you can see that it's really grown. It covers most of the U.S. In terms of state coverage. We're in parts of almost every state, but then each of those is targeted in specific areas. So this map just shows the outer boundary of each partnership. Within those, we also have maps that show priority areas within those larger boundaries. So you can see in this one, for example, to the southwest, there's the Southwest Willow Flycatcher, and that's quite a large geography, but actually within that, the work that we're doing is all in riparian corridors for that particular initiative. Next slide. So one thing that I wanted to point out is, though, even though most of our initiatives and all of the national initiatives are named after species, so we have Working Lands sage grouse, Working Lands gopher tortoise, or Working Lands golden-winged warbler. That's just the species that we're using to as a representative of benefits to a larger ecosystem and to all the species that co-occur with that species. And often what we see are that all the reasons that that particular species that we've named has a documented decline and may be considered for an Endangered Species Act listing. Those reasons are all also impacting the entire ecosystem and all the species that occur in it. So we often get many, maybe hundreds of other species that are also in decline. So in the case of golden wing warbler, we've documented up to 120 other species that are in decline, including many that are actually, well, this is a flip side on this one. The other thing I want to say about golden wing warbler is that many of the species that benefit, so these aren't necessarily species that are in steep decline, but they do benefit, are also species that are hunted. So that's one reason that, you know, everything we're doing is kind of a win-win, peace of mind. It's user-friendly for the ag producers. And so a lot of the species that benefit from the practices that we're putting on the ground are ones that can also be hunted. So people can go out hunting with their families on the project sites, and they may even be able to lease the property for hunting for some of these species. So we've funded some outcomes assessment for golden wing warbler and New England cottontail, and found that the projects that we do for those species also have significantly higher pollinator densities. And of course, there's been a lot in the news about declines in pollinators. So we're seeing that projects that we're doing for, you know, an avian or mammalian species is also benefiting pollinators. And then in out west for sage grouse and lesser prairie chicken, they've funded a number of studies that have documented that large numbers of other at-risk birds or some grassland birds are benefiting from the conservation practices that are put on the ground in the name of sage grouse or lesser prairie chicken, but have these larger benefits. Next slide. And this benefits to producer profitability is really a key feature of Working Lands for Wildlife. So the name kind of tells it all. It's Working Lands for Wildlife. So it's not a set-aside program per se. Most of it is targeting people that have active agricultural operations. And what we're trying to do is meld what we see as a resource need for these at-risk species with what they're trying to achieve in their ag operations, so that everything that we do is at a minimum economically neutral impact on an ag operation, but in most cases has an economic benefit to an ag operation. So that win-win between the conservation and the ag operation is really key to what we're trying to achieve with the Working Lands for Wildlife, because we feel that if we can do that, not only is farming more sustainable, but conservation is more sustainable. So we again have funded a number of studies and assessments that have looked at what we're achieving on the ground. And for gopher tortoise, for example, that first bullet, we're focused on reestablishing longleaf pine and managing longleaf pine stands. And we've measured that we have 72% more valuable poles in loblolly pine stands that we're managing under Working Lands for Wildlife gopher tortoise than we do in managed loblolly pine stands. So we're able again to have an economic benefit to the producer for doing these practices and focus on a native species over a non-native one. And then we also have this conservation value. For bobwhite, we've funded a literature review that was done by University of Tennessee, and they found higher beef yields, higher dollar returns for ag producers that included native warm season grasses as forage during the summer months. So they would have some paddocks of this native warm season grasses. They would still have primarily non-native and cool season native grasses as their forage, but they would incorporate these native warm season grasses. And when they did that and they were able to use that as alternative forage during drought conditions, we also saw a greater weight gain and higher reproductive rates in livestock. And then similarly in sage grouse country, they do a lot of woodland management. And so where they've removed invasive woody species, they've got 60% more forage for livestock and 2 more weeks of surface water. Next slide. And likewise, it's not just the individual ag producer that benefits. A lot of what we do also has economic benefits to the rural communities in those areas that I know that we looked at earlier on the map. So as a couple examples, in the areas where we're doing logging, we've measured, done an assessment, and 90% of those logging contracts are going to local logging firms. So a lot of that money is going back into the community. And likewise with our other conservation practices, I don't have a percentage for you, but I can tell you just anecdotally that I would say 90% is pretty accurate, that most of the conservation contracts that we put out, either the ag producer, him or herself, does the practice, or they bring in local folks to do it. So a lot of the money that's going on the ground in conservation is actually feeding the economy in these rural communities. And then we talked a little bit before about hunting opportunities. So where a lot of these projects also have benefits to game species, that's also an economic benefit to the larger community to either maintain or even create a new hunting opportunities. Thank you very much for your time today. If you'd like more information on any of this, you can email me. You can, if you just Google Working Lands for Wildlife, you'll get all kinds of content. If you look at that and you have any questions, let me know. This is my email address. And if you're out west, my counterpart, Tim Griffiths, is the contact for Working Lands for Wildlife, and I've put his email address in the slide as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Those were excellent presentations, and we'll look here to see if we have any questions also for you. But the first one I'd like to ask, and you can unmute your microphone if you want to ask a question. But Dave, so the funding that you got to do your projects, you said there was lots of funding that came to the shore, and some of it from the state of Maryland, but where else did you get funding?
Most of it's from the Maryland legislature.
Okay.
They have a program called the Chesapeake Bay Trust Fund, and it's very competitive, but wetlands is kind of on the top of the list. That's why we're very fortunate, like this next application we're going to be putting in for 22 wetland sites, you know. But we do get a good number of grants from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Most of them have been for fish studies or pollinator habitat, actually planting the pollinator habitat. And oh, this is a good one I forgot as far as wetland goes. I go over the Vienna Bridge when I go to work and when I come home. And for years, I've been looking at 2,200 acres out there of Phragmites, which is kind of a mess here in Maryland. With U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for the last 3 or 4 years, we've been spraying that Phragmites. And now when I go over the bridge, I'm not looking at this fuzzy looking Phragmites. I'm looking at this yellow stuff out there, which is wild rice. So it's been a tremendous conversion down there from Phragmites to wild rice, and the corresponding benefit to wildlife in that area. But as far as, go ahead.
How many staff do you have in your, I mean, what would be a typical budget for your RC&D? Is it vary depending on your projects, or?
Well, kind of, I had a man that's been working with me for 33 years on shore erosion projects, and well, he's 84. That was one of the slides that didn't show up. I'm sorry, I wanted to highlight him. But being 84 with underlying conditions, he hasn't worked since March, when COVID hit. And so we're hoping he will come back, but after getting used to not working, I'm not sure he will. But all of our staff is part-time here in the office, but we do have this is like a holdover spot for DNR and the U.S. Wildlife Service. We've run through about a dozen employees over the years here. They bring them to us for 2 or 3 years. They have money for projects, but no money for personnel. But they, as far as a full-time state employee, so they put them over here for 2, 3, or 4 years, and then when a permanent position opens up, then they go back to U.S. Forest Service or DNR. But four part-time employees keeps us going. And we have about 3 permanent employees right now too.
Okay, great. So, and Bridget, for you, how do RC&Ds, how could they partner with you in these programs? How do they find out about opportunities, or like, is there a sign-up period for some of the programs, or how does that work?
All of the money that goes for financial assistance really well, not all of it, but most of it goes through our program. So it goes directly to the producers. But I was trying to think about that while Dave was talking. I think there are some things, but I think I need to know more about what each RC&D is focusing on. But I'm thinking about some things that we do with hosting landowner workshops or field days, or where we have landowners willing, doing some wildlife use assessments of like after builds, you know, projects that are installed, and then doing some wildlife survey work. Let's see what else. You know, identifying landowners. Maybe you might have a relationship with a landowner that isn't familiar at all with Farm Bill programs, or even one that is, but hasn't signed up and might have some kind of really cool wildlife project they could do. And if, you know, if you have a good relationship with that individual, you could encourage them to go into their area office and sign up, and then stay involved in that project. Let's see. And then we have some specific topics, like one of them is prescribed burning, where we're looking to host a lot more workshops and have, you know, once we get past this whole COVID thing, you know, have booths at fairs and things where we educate people about some of the wildlife management that they should be doing on their property that maybe they don't quite realize the importance of it to wildlife, or maybe they don't even realize the importance to their forest stands economically to keep up with the management using some of the tools like prescribed burning or even timber thinning practices.
Okay. I believe Jean has a question for us. Jean?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. This is a really great conversation, and I'm really pleased to see so many people tuning in. I wanted to pick up on something, you know, Dave mentioned that a lot of farmers are trying to grow crops on wet fields. And I just wanted to share a conversation I had just yesterday with the local Farm Bill biologist who actually works for Pheasants Forever. And he was telling me about how they're actually using detailed crop yield data. So a lot of farmers have, you know, yield monitors right on their combines, and they can use that information to map out the field and identify areas that are where they're actually losing money, maybe, you know, because it's wet or seriously degraded soil. And so then they're working with that kind of yield and financial information to try to show the farmer really very specific areas of their field where they can then maybe convert that to a wetland if it's wet, or upland habitat. So really it's not necessarily a question, but I just wanted to make sure that people were aware, like maybe Pheasants Forever might be a really valuable partner for you to work with if they're in your area. But then maybe to ask Bridget or Dave if there are similar partnerships or other groups that we should all be looking at that might also be working in the same space.
Oh, I appreciate that, Jean. I hadn't heard of that program, but I'd like to contact you and find out about it. I don't know of anybody here, even Extension, that says we can show you where you're making money and where you're losing money, or the financial side of it, you know?
Yeah.
So
That's a big push right now. I think it's growing a lot in the last few years. So one of our big partners in terms of, you know, providing funds to them to hire staff to go in the field and work with producers is Pheasants Forever, Quail Forever. So don't let the name fool you. They actually do a lot of different species, not just quail and pheasant. And they have really high quality people. And precision ag is the phrase that you would use to talk about what Jean is, the idea that Jean's introduced. And that's something that we're looking at investing in, maybe even as soon as this year. If I've got an internal proposal into my own agency to hire more precision ag experts and put them out in the field to work with producers, because it just dovetails right into what we just talked about with Working Lands for Wildlife, where we really want to be able to be completely transparent with the producers and say, you know, help them collect that kind of data and help them understand that kind of data, and then present to them the program alternatives so that they can do, there's another phrase you might want to Google, it's called return on investment. So precision ag and return on investment. So those two ideas merge together, where you can do those kinds of assessments that Jean's talked about, where they look at, you know, what kind of
Hey, Kevin
production
Newcastle Conservation District, returning your call. I just want to make sure I understand what you're needing.
Uh-oh. Richard, your phone hit the...
Oh, he just muted himself. Yeah, so that's a growing idea, and I think you're going to see the agencies investing more and more in that. And I think it's great because it's providing the producer, again, still in control. It's all voluntary, but you provide them with all the information, all the alternatives, and then they make a decision. And that decision could be based on purely financial interest, and that's fine. And that may still lead them to a conservation type project. But it also sometimes could, it could be a conservation ethic that also plays into the decision. So if it's a close tie between, would I really make money if I planted this again, or, could I do some wildlife work? They might choose the wildlife work if it doesn't have a big impact on them financially. So yeah, that's a great field, and a growing field.
So let me ask.
And just,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to add one more footnote here. Where I'm located in north central Illinois, there's a lot of tile drainage going in. And so in this case, they were really debating between installing more tile or not. And even with looking at the precision ag and the yield data, tile was not going to pay off for like 5 years, and they could actually enroll that into a wetland and make a whole lot more money. So that return on investment, I think it's a very compelling story, especially as we start learning to speak the language of landowners and farmers who have very thin profit margins. I think it's a really good tool to help sell conservation.
So we've got 23 other folks here. Have any of you done either wildlife or wetland projects at your RC&D? If so, just unmute yourself, and we'd love to hear from you. Anyone else?
Hi, this is Pam Herdrick with High Country RC&D in Southeast Idaho. We have we are coordinating the Sand Creek Desert Collaborative, which is 18 land ranchers, 2 state agencies, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and NRCS. BLM and the state agencies are helping pay us for staff time a little bit, and then the landowners, a lot of the practices that they're getting funded through EQIP are actually, they're getting a little bit more than what the practice is calling are actually costing them. And so the landowners have agreed to what's the word that I'm going to assign a portion of their project to or a portion of their payment to help cover our 10% plus a little bit more to keep the doors open and fund some staff time. So that's how we've worked it out. It's rather, it was a big deal to get going, but it seems to be working pretty good.
And what kind of practices are they doing, Pam?
They have, here, I'll turn my video on. I'm sorry. They have, we've started with, it's sage grouse, sage steppe habitat. And we had, 3 years ago, we had a catastrophic fire of over 150,000 acres. And that 150,000 acres burned in 2 days. So we are working to establish fuel breaks there, and the ranchers will be intensively grazing those to maintain them once we've got them mowed and stuff. So it's about, I believe it's around 100 miles of fuel breaks that we're putting in. So it's been challenging, and it's been great, and it's been working because the landowners don't trust the federal agencies, but they trust us. Mm. So and they're starting to slowly learn to trust each other. So
how long have you been doing this?
We were asked to come in 2.5 years ago, and I would say that we started to put stuff on the ground last fall.
Great. Excellent. So, excellent.
So that's an idea, but it took a lot of coordinating and talking and having it happen.
And so how many years before had you started working on it then?
I think there was something in this sort of going on with this, and a number of different agencies, like our cooperative weed management areas. People started to talk. So I'm thinking it's been about 5 years in the works.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Anyone else have some projects like Pam and others? We'd love to hear from you. Just unmute your microphone and jump in.
Hi, this is Kelly. I'm at Quaco RC&D in Birmingham, Alabama. Want to say, hey, Jean. Hey, Pam. Yay. Nice to see everybody. We're doing a project with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and we manage their partners for Fish and Wildlife program. We get the contract. They still do all the work. They choose the projects. It mainly benefits darter habitat, mussel and snail species, so the aquatic species. But just through the grant management and the 10% of indirect, we're able to do a lot with that, especially since they're doing most all the work and we're doing the reporting.
That's great.
And we just finished a stream restoration. It was about $300,000 and about 1,200 linear feet.
So are you paying the contractors then?
We're
Or-
just doing the contracting, contracting and banking.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you. Hey,
Others,
Jean.
others who might have projects, feel free to unmute your microphone and jump in here.
I just wanted to add to Kelly's comment. I actually came from the Partnership Fish and Wildlife Program at Fish and Wildlife Service, and that's a persistent need of that program to have someone that can help them with administration of funds. And when I was there, I did a lot of grant writing and kind of ghost wrote out to various partners. So that probably is something that you should consider pursuing at other RC&Ds.
And the benefit of that too is that the contracting, we can do it so much quicker.
Yeah.
And we don't have to jump through as many hoops as if they would have done it under the federal umbrella in-house.
Yep.
Kelly, Dave again, that's our experience too, with a couple dozen grants that we've had from Fish and Wildlife Service. We just do the administration, the banking, and the reporting. That's it. And they care. I do like to get out there and make a presence on what's going on,
Yeah.
but that's just to show that we do exist. But
Yeah.
otherwise, we don't ever have to show up to the site at all.
Yeah, for everybody else, 10% just to write a
Yep.
couple of checks and take some photos and show up to a couple of meetings is quite lucrative.
I couldn't explain it any better. That's good. That's exactly what we do.
Great. Anyone else that has had some experience on wetlands or wildlife in your areas working with partners? There's somebody that wrote, Pam, Pam, you wrote that in there for the people to see that High Country RC&D is coordinating an effort with 18 landowners, 2 states, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They've worked on the agreement with the landowners for a portion of their QIP dollars. And that's what she was talking, yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't figure out how to get that to post, and I realized I just needed to enter.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Thank you.
But I put my contact information if people want to talk further.
Great, thank you. Anybody else has expertise in doing either administration of contracts for others that might be doing projects for wetlands and wildlife?
Well, Pam, Dana, before somebody comes on,
Yeah,
your original question was our funding for all our wetlands.
yeah.
I failed to mention that when we get a list of landowners who are interested, and we encourage them to go through NRCS's CP9 and CP23. Now, if that works, we only pay 10% of the project, which makes our budget go a whole lot further. However, if CP9 and CP23 doesn't work, we pay 100%.
So what is CP9 and CP23? What is that?
Bridget, can you answer that question? It's funding for different types of wetland.
I'm laughing because I have not been in the agency long enough that I use the numbers.
I should be able to answer that, but it's like 2 different kind of types of wetland. If you're a certain type of wetland with certain site characteristics, you're 23. if you got different characteristics, but it's still a wetland, you still fall on CP9.
I think it's some kind of distinction between, is it a restoration of a previous wetland or is it a creation of a new
Something like that.
wetland?
But that's been working real well to save our budget, make it go a lot further than we pay 10%.
Yeah.
So, and that was one of my questions, either for Bridget or Dave. Did you have to get special permits to recreate these wetlands, or they probably already have the wetland soils and plants? They just have been used, and so they were outside of a wetland preservation.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it depends on the project. If it's a pure creation with no hydric soils, then you wouldn't need any permits. Also, if it's what the Corps of Engineers calls a prior converted cropland, or PC wetland or PC crop field, prior converted is the phrase, then you also don't need any kind of permit to do that, as long as everything you're affecting has already been converted and has a long ag history. You don't need a permit. But if you're going into an area where you still, some aspect of what you're doing may impact an existing wetland, then you do need a permit. So often what happens is there's a tile or drainage ditch, and it's impacting the hydrology and therefore the vegetation and therefore the wildlife, but it's still technically a wetland. It's just a degraded wetland. So often you do have to get a permit. It's really very site specific.
and
Of the 800 projects we've done, we've never had to get a permit,
okay.
state, federal, or local.
And Josh Smith from your Western Maryland there said that he's having trouble unmuting his phone, but they've been implementing several wetland restoration projects.
There he goes.
Josh, there you go. You want to say something?
Oh, can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Yeah. Hello, everybody. Just briefly, a lot of what I said might be redundant based on Dave's presentation, but we do wetland restoration work in partnership with NRCS. And similar to what Kelly described, we get a 10% administrative fee for doing the contracting work and for doing the administration and the grant reporting. So it is a pretty good relationship for our council as well. Additionally, we have 2 employees that are funded by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They're technicians that work to implement some of these projects. They design wetland projects, but they also go out and try to get more interest in the WRP program or the WRE program with landowners in the area. And they're based out of Annapolis, the state capital there. So even though we are predominantly a Western Maryland focused organization, we do still get to do some of these projects. And like Dave mentioned, a lot of it is tied to Chesapeake Bay funding.
Yeah. Okay, great. And Jean, we'll end with you. You put some information about CP23 in the chat box.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yep, and I think I found CP9 too. I'm just putting that in there right now here.
Perfect. So we're gonna end. We've got another survey we'd like you to fill out. So Rosie, if you'll put that survey up, and that way we can kind of see where we have gone from when we began the topic and where we are currently now. And our next project, or our next call, will be on March the 11th, same time, 2 p.m. Eastern, and we'll be talking about water quality and 319 projects and how that might be used by RC&Ds. Susan, do you have any final comments you'd like to make before we sign off? We've got a couple minutes if we had another question, but Susan, do you have anything else you need to do other than everybody please fill out the survey and submit it?
Yeah, everybody fill out the survey, please, please, please. We need this information for reporting, and we'll send out a follow-up email with the webinar video attached to that, and some follow-up information for the next webinar. Just want to thank everybody for being here. We appreciate your time and interest in these webinars, and we hope that you found something useful and helpful in it.
And thank you to our 2 presenters, Dave and Bridget. Thank you so much. That was a lot of great information.
Dana,
You're
can I
welcome.
add one more thing? I don't,
Yes.
2 seconds here. I just wanted to mention to folks, anybody that's involved in any partnerships that do land acquisition, signing private property up for any of the easement programs in the Farm Bill, they pay the ag land value. And if you've got a partner like a state wildlife agency or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service refuge acquisition boundary expansion, you can often use those Farm Bill programs as a mechanism to basically get the price down for the partnership. And then the partnership can come in and buy it after the easement's gone on from the producer. So you can kind of work that all in ahead of time and lay that out as a multi-phase way to get acquisition and kind of stretch your conservation acquisition dollars. I just wanted to share that with everybody. In case
Excellent.
there's somebody out there, it helps.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, thank you to our speakers and everybody that participated.
welcome.
We will see you on March the 11th.